Now this, it seemed like some of the people in your film, there were some people who wanted it, and some people who really didn't. And I have to say, I did notice a bias. I didn't see a lot of farmers in there talking. I mean, you would think that the farmers would want it the most. Right. Because I think you mentioned that there used to be, was it 1,000 dairy farms in that area, and now there's only 10?
Now there's only 10.
What happened to them all?
Well, what happened is the same thing that happens with everything else. I mean, there's a gigantic grocery store instead of a little one, a little mom and pop store. In New York especially, in a lot of these villages, there's a Walmart instead of a main street in town.
Walmart.
So that's what I'm talking about, is there are these huge milk farms up in further upstate New York, or the milk
so
gets
they've taken
over all the little dairy farms.
Okay, but so there are some farmers, but there weren't very many that you had on film. Even so, it looked like it was going to get shoved through, that they were going to take the money and at least one of the largest dairy farmers, or
one of the largest dairy farmers. There were a few. There were 3 or 4 people.
Right, but the people who didn't want to, I have to say, there was a little weighted, interestingly, because they were most of the people who were the most articulate in your film, who were against it, were from New York City, and they were highly educated. You got doctors, publishers. You were lucky that you had some very smart, articulate people to interview for your film who were working against it.
Yes.
So I would imagine the farmers were, at least the examples we had, were not so articulate.
Well, I don't think so. I think Frank Batchelor, who was the supervisor, I really feel like he was very articulate. And he was a farmer, too.
He was sympathetic.
He was sympathetic, and I think he was articulate. And actually, John Hamilton, who's the farmer you're talking about, he's my neighbor, and I think he's great.
Really?
I mean, and I think
he sounded like a total idiot in this film. He did.
Well,
okay. I mean, I know you think he's great, but
he's got a great, and he does the dairy festival up there, and I mean, but that is his personality.
Okay.
I mean, he's a character.
He's a character. Okay, but then if you say, well, anyway,
anyway, the other person that you're talking about, who's the publisher, she's lived up there for 30 years, and her whole family is from up there. I mean, when she says that,
so she's not really an outsider.
She's not really an outsider at all. So, I mean, I think that's part of it, is that the people in the town were really the farmers, and the people from New York, and the people who were from New York but who've been up there for a long time, were getting along very well until this wind issue happened. And then when that happened, it totally polarized everyone. I mean, I think until then they were really all trying to work together.
Well, but yeah. It did look like it was very harmful to community relations, because you had people that felt very kindly towards one another, because it was a small rural town, and then the people who got on opposite sides of the issue wouldn't even speak to one another. Right. I mean, that
happens in a lot of towns.
Oh, you mean over this issue?
Meredith, over this issue, yeah.
One of the interesting things that you pointed out. Well, I was interested. I always thought that wind power was the clean alternative to, say, coal or oil, but you point out that like that they're all limited liability companies that are developing these, when that means they're really hard to sue if anything goes wrong. I work for lawyers, so. Right. But how often, and they're only leasing, they'll put these things up, and it's a 28-year lease or something, and then what happens? What happens if, I mean, do people have any alternatives if they say, well, we don't want it anymore? Then you're stuck with a 400-foot, 20, 40, 80 windmills. Right. What the heck are you going to do with those? If you change your mind and go, whoa, this is terrible for property values. I don't want to look at this stuff. It's very industrial looking.
Yeah, I think that that's one of the things that the film I'm hoping is telling people is be very careful and look into this before you get these put up or before you sign, because
it's not pretty.
Well, other than not being pretty, too, I mean, it changes the whole area. The area becomes an industrial area. It's not a little country setting anymore. And I think that's one of the things, is that these people sometimes, they've been in these places for generations, and then all of a sudden, it's completely different, a couple years later. And I don't think people realize. I think a lot of these towns really regret it later. So I think, you know, these cost millions of dollars to put up.
How much do you think for one?
Well, they say it's $3 million. So, they cost a lot of money to take down, and they don't even take all the concrete out of the ground. They just take the first 6 feet out and then cover it over. Well, there were a lot of issues that you brought up, but it is a happy ending, though, in that the town, I believe, they hold an election. That's a spoiler.
Oh, I'm sorry. Never mind. There's no happy ending. Forget what I said.
But I think that one of the things that happened in Meredith, it's okay. One of the things that happened in Meredith, and one of the things that I wanted to bring up in the film is that when you say I'm green or, you know, it's renewable, there's got to be a lot more to the story. You can't just say that. You can't just put up a sticker. You can't just send in $5. There's a little more responsibility there to find out what's really happening and what that really means, and to really, I mean, it takes a long time, and there has to be a lot of discussion and negotiation, but people have to come to an agreement and don't just, you know, say to the company, just do anything you want.
Well, and also one of the things you pointed out in your film was that most of these companies, most of these developers they're getting huge tax incentives and write-offs, and they depreciate the investment over and over again.
Yes.
Yes. And this isn't, you know, like your small entrepreneur who's into wind development. It's Citigroup. It's I don't know if it's Goldman Sachs, but you know.
It is.
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So when you see a company name like Green Mountain Energy, I'm just putting it out there.
Right. For instance.
Or for instance, Maple Ridge, which is the one in New York, which is.
It sounds so homey.
It sounds homey and wonderful, but Maple Ridge is actually owned by a lot of different entities. And
investors. And
if you look into wind companies, they're owned by, you know, energy companies and financial institutions. So,
well, just in wrapping this up, I do want to mention that, as we said at the beginning of the show, that this is your film is Windfall.
It's Windfall.
It is being featured. I think this is the regional premiere, and it is part of the Talking Pictures Festival. And by popular demand, there's another screening today at 11.
There's a screening at 11, and there'll also be another question and answer, which
the
discussion
is it next
at the Next Theater.
And where's that?
I'm not sure. I'm being driven there.
But you're going to have to look up Next Theater in Evanston.
Yeah, or else you can look up talkingpictures.org.
Talkingpictures.org. There's lots to talk about, and I learned a lot from your film. It actually was kind of creepy and scary at points. And I used to just worry about birds. Because initially when they started doing these, like out in California and stuff, they would put up these giant things in migratory paths, like you know, and killed thousands of birds. But this is a different situation. And so, I mean, you're not necessarily saying wind power is all bad, but it's in these areas where people are living close by that it's not necessarily such a great idea.
Well, the bats are a big problem.
Bats.
I think if I was going to do,
right?
if I was going to do another short film, it would be about the bats and the amount of bats that are being killed now by wind turbines. There's an alarming number.
Is it the pressure that?
It's the air pressure. It's like they get the bends when they get close.
Oh my gosh! Well, and bats are already having problems.
They're already having problems. But I just wanted to also just plug the festival, because I think it's so great that last night there were people who live among the turbines, and there were people from Evanston talking together and like really having a dialogue about what's going on. And I think the most thing that the film does, I hope, is to get people to talk openly about it and to discuss it in their own community and what they want.
Instead of just buying what the mainstream media is saying.
Right.
Or in the marketing.
Right.
The marketing.
As someone says in the film, ask questions, do your homework.
Well, this is Laura Israel we've been talking to. You're listening to WLUW 88.7. This is Live from the Heartland. Laura Israel, thank you very much for coming on the show. Loved the film. Highly recommend it. Not supposed to do that on the air. So what? Thanks so much for coming.